In the winter of 1338, on the icy shores of Lake Issyk-Kul, a handful of monks recorded a haunting line in their chronicles. A great pestilence began among the Mongols. No one knew it yet, but this quiet entry marked the opening chapter of a catastrophe that would fracture the largest land empire in human history. The Mongols, conquerors of continents, were about to face an enemy they could not intimidate, negotiate with, or destroy. For more than a century, the Mongol Empire had devoured cities, shattered kingdoms, and redrawn maps from Korea to Hungary. But empires rarely fall from the outside. They rot from within. And in the 1340s, something invisible crept across the trade routes the Mongols themselves had built. A microbe, carried by fleas hidden in bales of grain and merchant caravans, slipped unnoticed across the Silk Road. In the Mongol city of Sarai, merchants whispered of entire households collapsing overnight. In the markets, bodies were covered by cloth and carried away before sunrise. But the officials insisted nothing was wrong. The empire had weathered rebellions, assassinations, and frozen winters. Surely this was no different. They didn't yet understand what they were facing, the most lethal pandemic in recorded history. Across the empire, commanders reported something unprecedented. Their soldiers were dying faster than they could be replaced. Entire garrisons fell silent, their watchtowers unmanned. The Mongols, once the masters of mobility, now faced a different kind of war. One fought not with steel, but with breath. Historians often point to the Black Death's toll on Europe. But its first empire-sized victim was the Mongol realm itself. Trade slowed, governors fled, armies withered. By 1350, the empire founded by Genghis Khan was splintering into isolated, terrified khanates. The greatest conquerors on earth had finally met a force they could not outrun. Long before the plague reached them, the Mongols believed their empire was protected by destiny itself. From 1206 onward, Genghis Khan's armies seemed invincible, a storm of horse archers that shattered civilizations in months. But beneath this aura of divine favor was something far more fragile, a political machine held together by fear, loyalty, and a single family bloodline. After Genghis's death in 1227, the empire expanded even faster. Ogedei Khan's armies reached the gates of Vienna in 1241. Mongol ships threatened Japan. Caravans carrying silks, medicine, and porcelain stretched from Beijing to Baghdad. But rapid expansion hides a dangerous truth. Every new conquest adds new fractures. By the 1290s, the unified empire had already splintered into four major khanates: the Yuan Dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde across Russia. Each claimed to be the true guardian of Genghis Khan's legacy. Each distrusted the others. The Silk Road, the arteries of the empire, carried everything: spices, jade, silver, rumors, spies, and pathogens. To keep this trade alive, the Mongols created a system of relay stations called YAM, allowing riders to cross Asia in weeks instead of months. This was the world's first true global network, and its first global vulnerability. In the early 1300s, merchants began reporting strange die-offs of marmots in the mountains of Central Asia. Hunters noticed fleas abandoning their hosts en masse. Local shamans warned of a wind of death that traveled from burrow to burrow. These stories were dismissed as folklore, right until humans began showing the same symptoms. The Mongols relied heavily on steppe wildlife for fur, food, and trade goods. But few understood the ecosystems they were disturbing. As hunting intensified and rodents were displaced, Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, found new carriers. The disease did not emerge suddenly. It simmered beneath the empire for decades, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment arrived around 1331, when a devastating epidemic erupted in Hubei, China. Contemporary records speak of entire villages collapsing in days. The Yuan Dynasty, the Mongol rulers of China, scrambled to contain it, but the bureaucracy was fractured and corrupt. The disease grew faster than the government could respond. As the plague moved north, Chinese doctors described horrific symptoms: swellings as large as peaches, blackened extremities, and victims coughing blood. This was the bubonic and pneumonic plague acting together, a dual outbreak with a mortality rate approaching 70%. Not even the Mongol elite, living behind palace walls, were safe. Panic spread across the Yuan court. Officials fled Beijing in secret. Tax collection collapsed. Peasant rebellions erupted across the countryside, some claiming heaven itself had withdrawn its mandate from the Mongols. For the first time, whispers of regime collapse felt real. But China was only the beginning. From the ports of Tianjin to the bazaars of Samarkand, the plague moved along every artery of Mongol commerce. By 1345, reports reached the Golden Horde. Whole towns across Central Asia were silent. The empire's beating heart, its vast commercial network, was now spreading death instead of wealth. By the mid-1340s, the Mongol world was a fragile web stretching across continents, and the plague had begun snapping its strands. Khanates blamed one another for the epidemic. Diplomatic envoys vanished. Trade missions stopped arriving. Something enormous was breaking, but few understood that the collapse had already begun. In 1346, the plague reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genoese colony besieged by the Mongol Golden Horde. What happened there would become one of the darkest turning points in the history of warfare. The siege had dragged on for years, but now the Mongol camp was dying. Their soldiers collapsed before they reached the walls. Yanibeg Khan, the Mongol commander, faced a nightmare scenario. Retreat would expose weakness. Continuing the siege meant watching his army rot day by day. Then someone proposed a strategy so unthinkable it still echoes through history books: the use of plague corpses as weapons. According to contemporary accounts, Mongol engineers loaded catapults with the bodies of plague victims. One after another, the bloated corpses arced over the city walls. They crashed into the streets of Kaffa with sickening finality. Whether this was desperation or deliberate biological warfare, the effect was the same. The defenders panicked. Some fled to ships anchored in the harbor. Others barricaded themselves indoors, praying the winds would spare them. But the disease moved faster than hope. Within weeks, Kaffa became a floating graveyard. Those ships fled west to Constantinople, Sicily, Genoa, and Venice. With them traveled grain, spices, and fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. By 1347, Europe began to die. But rarely do history classes mention where the pandemic's European chapter began: in a Mongol war zone on the Crimean coast. While Europe braced for catastrophe, the Mongol world was collapsing from within. At Sarai, seat of the Golden Horde, population records show a sudden plunge in tax revenues, a sign that entire towns had ceased to exist. Caravans stopped arriving. Whole regions simply went silent. The Chagatai Khanate fared even worse. Political factions blamed each other for the plague. Assassinations multiplied. Within a single decade, it fragmented into warring mini-states, each led by ambitious tribal leaders dreaming of restoring the old glory. None realized they were fighting over a corpse. In Persia, the Ilkhanate spiraled into chaos after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335. Without a clear successor, rival factions crowned puppet khans, each surviving only a few months. Plague turned this instability into freefall. Persian chroniclers wrote of entire villages deserted, fields overgrown, irrigation canals collapsing. Even the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongol rulers of China, began to unravel. The plague killed tens of millions. Rebellions surged. Local militias rose to protect their own towns as the central government dissolved under its own weight. A new force, the Red Turbans, declared the Mongols had lost heaven's mandate. These rebellions were not merely political. They were fueled by desperation. With fertile lands abandoned and granaries untouched due to fear of contamination, famine stalked northern China. Families starved beneath the shadow of the largest empire ever forged. When the Red Turbans marched, they found villages ready to join them. By 1350, what had once been a unified Mongol network of roads, envoys, and tax collectors had turned into isolated enclaves of fear. The empire's greatest strength, mobility, had vanished. Couriers refused to ride. Merchants abandoned their routes. Every city became a fortress against its own neighbors. The turning point was not a single battle, but a revelation. The Mongols had built a global empire, and the plague had used it as a superhighway. The same roads that carried tribute, armies, and ideas now carried death with equal efficiency. The empire's infrastructure became the mechanism of its destruction. By the end of the 1340s, the Mongol Empire existed largely in name. It still appeared vast on maps, still claimed authority through lineage, but its arteries had clotted. Its rulers were isolated. Its future was no longer measured in decades, but in months. By the early 1350s, the Mongol geopolitical landscape looked less like an empire and more like the shattered remains of one. Each khanate faced its own collapse. The Golden Horde's trade routes emptied. The Ilkhanate fractured beyond repair. And in China, rebellions swelled like a tide, preparing to wash the Mongols into oblivion. The Golden Horde was the first to implode economically. Sarai, once a thriving metropolis on the Volga River, fell into silence as plague corpses floated downstream. Russian principalities refused tribute payments. The Horde's power, once feared across Eastern Europe, slipped away without a single decisive battle. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate's downfall turned even more violent. Local warlords seized cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, believing the Mongol order had dissolved. Tribal alliances shifted weakly. Entire regions transformed into zones of banditry, where caravans were stripped before they crossed the horizon. Persia sank into what chroniclers called the time without a king. Dozens of claimants fought for the Ilkhanate throne. Some lasted months, others mere days. Cities fortified themselves, refusing to recognize any authority beyond their walls. The Mongol imperial dream had dissolved into anarchy. Meanwhile, in China, the Yuan Dynasty faced the deadliest combination possible: plague, famine, and revolution. Rebel leaders like Zhu Yuanzhang rallied peasants under promises of stability and divine legitimacy. One by one, Mongol strongholds fell. The empire that had once conquered China now struggled to defend even its capital. In 1368, Beijing fell. The Mongols fled north in a bitter winter retreat, abandoning palaces, libraries, and the symbols of power they had held for a century. Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed himself emperor of the Ming Dynasty. For the first time in generations, China was free of Mongol rule. Hidden beneath the political collapse lay a deeper truth. The Mongols' greatest achievement, the creation of a connected Afro-Eurasian world, had also been their downfall. For the first time in history, disease could travel from the mountains of Kyrgyzstan to the ports of Italy in a single season. Connectivity had become catastrophe. Historical records reveal a chilling pattern. Whenever a Mongol trade hub reported unusual deaths, outbreaks appeared thousands of miles away weeks later. This wasn't coincidence. It was infrastructure. The Yam system, once the pride of the empire, had transformed into a perfect distribution network for the deadliest pathogen of its age. Yet the Mongols themselves did not understand the biology behind their downfall. To them, the plague was a curse, a sign of heaven's anger, or the work of evil spirits. This misunderstanding made coordinated response impossible. Each khanate improvised, but none survived. Even after the worst years, the Mongol world never recovered. The Golden Horde survived in name, but fractured into rival hordes. The Ilkhans disappeared entirely. The Chagatai Khans became puppets of stronger neighbors. And the Yuan remnants fled into the steppe, where they would eventually form a new but diminished power, the Northern Yuan. And yet, scattered in letters and chronicles, a few clues point to something deeper. Hints that the Mongol collapse wasn't merely an accident of biology, but the consequence of a world they themselves had reshaped. Trade that once enriched them now killed them. Diplomacy that once connected continents now spread disease faster than any army. In the end, the Mongol Empire was undone not by rebellion alone, nor by rival kingdoms, nor by internal strife. It collapsed because it had unified the world too effectively. The plague needed only one generation of global connectivity to transform a regional outbreak into a hemisphere-wide cataclysm. Centuries later, the Mongol Empire is remembered for conquest, mobility, and fearsome discipline. But its collapse holds a quieter lesson, one far more relevant to the modern world. The Mongols built the most connected trade network the Earth had ever seen. And in doing so, they accidentally created the perfect conditions for a global pandemic. Today, a plane can cross continents in hours, not months. Cargo ships move through global ports day and night. Digital networks link billions of people instantly. The scale is larger, but the pattern is familiar. Connectivity brings prosperity and vulnerability. The Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people, but its geopolitical impact was just as profound. It ended the era of Mongol dominance. It reshaped China, Persia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. And it showed that even the mightiest empires can crumble when the world becomes too interconnected for safety. Historians still debate the exact origins of the Black Death, but most agree on one point. Without the Mongol world system, its imperial roads, its secured trade routes, its unprecedented movement of people and goods, the pandemic would have remained regional. Instead, it became global. There is a certain irony in this history. The Mongols sought to control everything, from the speed of communication to the movements of merchants. Yet the one force they couldn't restrain was microscopic. Their empire was laid low not by a rival Khan, but by bacteria carried on the backs of rodents and fleas. Modern pandemics follow the same logic. They spread along our most efficient routes: air corridors, shipping lanes, megacities, and global markets. What the Mongols created on horseback, we have recreated with engines and fiber optics. Disease still rides the pathways of empire. But the Mongol collapse also speaks to resilience. New states rose from the ashes: the Ming in China, the Timurids in Central Asia, the Muscovite state in Russia. Human societies adapt, rebuild, and reshape themselves after catastrophe, often emerging very different from what came before. When we look at the ruins of the Mongol Empire, we see both warning and prophecy. Connectivity is power, until it becomes a pathway for disaster. No empire, no matter how vast, is immune from the unintended consequences of its own success. This was true in the 14th century. It remains true today. In the end, the plague did what no army could. It stopped the horsemen of Genghis Khan. It ended a century of conquest. And it reshaped the world's balance of power for generations. Long after the last Mongol archer disappeared into the steppe, the consequences of that collapse still echo across continents. Thanks for watching, and thanks for all your likes, comments, and subscriptions. Let me know in the comments what you want me to cover next.